So, so
Sorry, there's a song in this somewhere. Turkey bells, da da da.
yeah. So what they would, but they also had another way that they would mark them. So sometimes they did brand them, but branding really is something that kind of developed out west. If they branded them here, most often they branded them on their horns. They put a brand mark on
Okay.
their horns. But the other thing that they did, the ownership marks, because it might have been only like if you had a herd of cattle, um, and if you had a herd of cattle, they might have only had maybe the lead cow had a bell.
Okay.
But every animal, pig, sheep, cow, horse, they had their ears cropped. And and every farmer supposedly had his mark, like you might have two narrow slits cut out of the left ear of your cows. I might have two holes in the right ear of my cows. The problem becomes then if I sell my cow to your cow, then you add your marks to my marks. And so it was a messed up system, but these animals had crop marks and chop marks. Their ears would have been ragged because of all the cuts and slits and holes in them. And you think about it, were they all chopped up that much? I found in the course of doing the research for this cattle book, a painting. It's not a very good painting, but it's a painting of, I'll send it to you and we can throw it up on here. A painting of a couple of cows and a couple of sheep, done probably in the Shenandoah Valley by some person who fancied themselves an artist and didn't really get the perspective quite right on the cow's head and things like that. But the cool thing is, if you blow up the painting and look at the animal's ears, they were just ragged with being chopped up and stuff. So it verified what we suspected, that what every animal's ears would have looked like. And it also, interestingly enough, the cattle were red, and that's a whole nother thing we can talk about is, when we go down, walk through the fields today, the cattle that we see are more often than not black, and they would have more often than not been red in this time. But back to your original question. So how did the farmers in the valley have fields of grain, corn and wheat and rye, and have hundreds of head of cattle? And the way they did that is two things. One is you didn't fence in cattle or any livestock. That's more of a modern thing.
Okay.
Started doing it in the late 1800s, but you didn't fence in the cattle, you fenced in the fields. You used split rail fences that are easily moved from field to field, and you planted the crop. When the crop started coming in, you put the fence around the field, so you protected, so nothing could get into the field. And
the split rail would have been easy to
easy, that's why they used split rail fences and not permanent fences, because in the fall, after the most of the corn was harvested, you could let the cattle into the field to eat what was left and fertilize your field
right
at the same time.
Which they still do to this day.
Which they still do to this day. But the other main thing was that in the springtime, everybody, drovers, or just the farmer, one farmer for all his friends, would go up and down, up and down the local roads, gathering up everybody's cattle. Might get 10 from this farmer and 10 from this farmer, and they'd make a list of it, and they'd say, here's the list of the 10 cows that Richard has. It's one red and white cow with red ears and these crops on the ears. One brown cow with white spots on the belly, and here's the crops on these ears. And they'd pay the drover 50 cents a head, and he'd drive them to the mountains, to the Blue Ridge on the east, if you're closer there, or to the Alleghenies on the west. And
to the public lands, as they would call it in Montana.
Well, it was yes, it was.
Greener pastures. Yeah.
And it was sort of no man's land until the National Forest came in and the Shenandoah National Park came in, and then it became the public lands in the 20th century. And they'd graze them there all summer, and they'd just kind of free range go from opening to opening. There were natural openings and created openings up in the mountains. They called them, if you go to the east to the Blue Ridge, go off the Blue Ridge Parkway or through Skyline Drive, they called them balds. Mostly probably because the Scotch Irish called them balds. If you go to the west,
What's that word? How do you spell that?
BALDS, like you're bald, like you don't have any
It's
hair.
bald, facing the mountain. Yeah, no tree.
Yeah, or like you don't have any trees, and so grass would grow up in those and so
Probably caused by fire.
probably some of it's just natural, but fire probably opened up a lot of it, and the Native Americans opened up a lot of it.
Okay.
Because that's the same thing. The deer and the elk would go up in there. So.
Cool. All right. So we're up to how long did that particular time, when would that have been? Driving cattle up to the balds?
Starting as soon as Augusta County people were here in the 1740s, 30s, 40s, they'd drive them up into the summer. They would graze them there all summer, and then the fall they would bring down the herds of cattle. They said they had to bring them down before the acorns fell from the trees, because if the cattle ate the acorns, it would cut up their insides.
Okay.
So they were, and that was after, because the wheat was harvested in July.
Let's not even get started on chestnuts. Right.
Right. Yeah. Well, the chestnuts, they would, after the cattle were out of the mountains, and they would then drive the pigs up into the mountains to eat the chestnuts and fatten them up for hog butchering time.
So the pigs were the same way.
The pigs were the same way. I don't know that they put bells on pigs, but their ears were cropped, and they would just drive them up for a short period of time, let them fatten on the chestnuts before they brought them back down and butchered them. But the cattle, in the fall, you would get these monstrous herds of cattle coming down out of the mountains on every valley road from here to, in the 1700s, they drove them all the way to Philadelphia.
Okay.
Drove them, down the valley to Winchester and on to Philadelphia. And, you could only drive cattle a dozen miles a day. So every farmer who lived on a major road, like what became the Valley Pike, would plant corn right along the Valley Pike, and the drovers would come through and pay the farmer so many cents per head to rest the cattle in his cornfield that night, basically feed the cattle. And the farmer gets a little bit of money, sells his crop, and gets his field fertilized. And so...
Did they run cattle up like the Valley Pike up US 11?
Oh, absolutely.
So absolutely. They had a toll every summer.
They had a toll. It was tolled by a head, and cattle were more per head than sheep or goats. Okay. Or pigs. But yeah, everybody.
If you had 18 wheels, no.
Yeah. Actually, and so the toll was, if you're walking it so much, if you're on a horseback it so much, if you're on a stagecoach it's so much, if you're on a covered wagon it's so much. The wider the wheels of the vehicle, the less the toll was, because they were actually doing road maintenance too by kind of
oh yeah, not grooving, that's cutting out the grooves.
Right. So like a covered wagon with big wide wheels wasn't as much as a stagecoach.
Route 11 is episode number 4255.
Okay, yeah, we need to do Route 11, because that's pretty interesting. Because get this, so think about it. Stanton would have had cattle in the fall. Stanton, Greenville, Harrisonburg would have had, and Bridgewater, they talk about
Mosey,
every one of them. So in Bridgewater, there's a diary where the farmer talks about, 135 fat cattle came through here on Saturday. 236 fat cattle came through, because these were all cattle that were going to market. So they were fattened up, ready to be butchered.
Okay.
So there's a story from the 1850s in Harrisonburg where a big herd, and we're talking about hundreds of cattle, were going to downtown Harrisonburg, right where the courthouse is now, and something got in, like a dog or something got in and spooked them. And this lady wrote about it, and she was just a little girl, and she was staying with her aunt, and they were on the front porch of their house, and she remembers the cattle just started going everywhere and stampeding and ripping off the front porches of the houses. And her aunt grabbed her and ran inside, and it was hours, they said, before they got the cattle under control. And nobody got killed, but there was a lot of property damage, and she said her aunt was just beside herself for hours and hours afterwards. So that, and then up in Winchester, there's some articles in the newspaper where they're complaining about the cattle coming through. Not because, and think about this. Okay, so your roads weren't paved, so they're dusty. So the cattle are kicking up dust, but they're also, doing what cattle do, which is poop. And so you've got all this cow manure, cow pies in the streets of your cities.
Because they're coming right through town.
Right through downtown. And Winchester, the complaint in the newspaper was not that they were coming through downtown, but that they were doing it on Sunday morning and disturbing church services.
Oh, yeah.
So, and it asked that they just please have a little more respect for the church services and not run them through. And they also were saying the covered wagons were kind of the Teamsters of the 19th century, and they were coming through with they had bells on their wagons, and it was also disturbing the church service. So it was they were asked to show some more respect.
No cowbells in the middle of Almighty Fortune.
Yeah. So when did
Pastor Hinkle of the Lutheran Church said, yeah.
Exactly. So you ask about when this stopped, and when it's. I should also say, so it was Bald's if it was east of the mountain in the Blue Ridge, in the German parts, the western part of the valley, especially like in Rockingham and Augusta, Rockbridge, the openings were called sods. Like if you've heard now of Dolly Sods in West Virginia, that's because it was a clearing up on top of the mountain. So because the cattle were up there, and you might go visit your cattle, once or twice a summer, or sometimes they paid in the area over that became the Shenandoah National Park. There were tenant farmers who just stayed up in the summer and checked on the cattle. They'd have to salt them, give them salt, make sure the bears didn't get in and mess with the cattle, but and just check on them generally. And so things began to change in the early 1900s. The National Forest bought up a bunch of land, in the Alleghenies, and so for a while, people were still going up there, sending the cattle up there, and they were just paying the National Forest 50 cents a head to be able to pasture them all summer.
Teddy Roosevelt, basically.
The teens, 19-teens.
Right.
And there are some early pictures from the National Forest. If you go to Bridgewater and you look in their archives, the National Forest had been pretty much timbered over, so it wasn't the big, beautiful National Forest it is now. It's been timbered over. The reason they bought the federal government bought that land was because there was so much erosion happening from the timbering.
Right.
People were getting flooded out. There were these disastrous floods. So they bought it to replant the forest and protect the water supply.
And this is true even of the Blue Ridge, right? Because I've always heard that. The Blue Ridge, yeah. So it wasn't a lot.
If they could get the equipment up to cut down a tree, they did. And so the forests that we know of today are probably as more forested now than ever in history in our recorded history. Right. And so so National Forest was created to stop that soil erosion. And so the cattle were still pastured up there for probably a couple decades. And there are pictures we've got this great picture of cattle up in the National Forest, these little scrubby trees, and the cattle that are up there, it's a black and white picture, so we can't tell, but more than likely, looking at the body of them, they're red cattle, but they have bells on them. So okay. It's just really fun to see. But
playing Shenandoah, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm sure they were singing it with the bells. It was a bell, the first bovine bell choir. Mm-hmm. But in the Shenandoah National Park in the 30s, when they started condemning land and pushing people off the land in the Shenandoah National Park, that kind of evolved a lot differently. And the cattle weren't allowed to come up there. And so people were getting pushed off the land up there. So you're losing your pasturing rights there. The other thing is when you run cattle, indiscriminately in the summer, you really have no capability to control what cow breeds with what cow. So you don't have any quality control. And there became an increased idea of maybe some selective breeding to improve the production of the cow. And
More beef.
finally, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you began to see a split. Before that time, cows were cows. Hey, if it gave a lot of milk, you milked it. It was a dairy cow. If it was, big and fat and you could eat it, it became, it was butchered. Started seeing really development of breeds specifically for dairy and specifically for beef.
Okay.
And what kind of spurred that on, you think about how one thing creates a ripple effect for another, is refrigerated train cars.
And tell me when this would have been again.
We're talking about early 1900s.
Okay.
And
just literally ice, big hunks of ice and train cars.
Well, big hunks of ice, but milk.
Okay.
Before, if you had dairy, you had to produce butter or cheese.
Right.
Because milk doesn't
last.
If you're living out in the country, what do you do with all that milk? Your farmer can't drink that much. You can take some. Grandma Moses and her husband were taking some, and they were milking and taking it at Stanton and sell it. But that's a few gallons a day. But if you start having more dairy animals and you're producing a lot more milk, you're going to dump it out if you can't make it into butter. And there wasn't much cheese production around here. The climate wasn't really right for it. So it was either make a lot of butter or don't have dairy cattle. But with the refrigerated train cars, you could take milk and you could ship it to the big cities where you had a market for it, like Richmond, Baltimore, and Alexandria, and Washington, D.C., and you could get rid of your milk. And there were also now ways they invented a test to tell if cattle had tuberculosis or not, because tuberculosis could be passed through the milk. So those veterinary advances, refrigerated cars, created a whole dairy industry that was milk related rather than butter related. And then there were some animals who were better for beef animals. And so like the shorthorn cattle split, and they started having shorthorn cattle that were dairy cattle, and then a whole different, almost became a different breed that were shorthorn beef cattle. And so these cattle were no longer that quadruple purpose. A shorthorn dairy animal was not a good beef animal. You didn't put a yoke on it and work it in the fields. And it wasn't going to survive out, as free range. They just needed to be coddled a little bit. Think about trying to run Holstein cattle out into national forest and expecting them to survive.
Right.
It just wouldn't happen. So there had been most people's cattle before the early 1900s were just called scrub cattle. They were a conglomeration of all those breeds that had been in Virginia for a couple hundred years, and these were hardy survivors who could do anything. But they weren't really good at milking, and they weren't really good at producing a lot of beef. They were just really good at four things, and they were survivors. So people started doing selective breeding and breeding for milk production. And so they started fencing in those animals because they didn't want them to go out and breed indiscriminately with Farmer Jones's scrub bull.
So and keeping the cows out of the fence to keeping the cows in the fence.
Yes, that's exactly right. Started fencing in instead of fencing out.
Right.
Eventually, you get range laws that are fence in or fence out, and so in Virginia today, actually depends county by county if it's fenced in or fenced out. Really doesn't make a lot of difference now. Most farmers want to fence their animals in because they want to. It's all about economics, and you're not going to let your cattle. Plus,
free range turkeys, or they would still be fenced in now, except
right.
They just wouldn't be in a turkey house.
That's right. That's right. And cattle and turkeys were first free range. We can do a whole poultry series at some point, because this is the Rocky County to the north.
I've got two more shows: the poultry and the Grandma Moses.
That's right. Grandma Moses would be a great one too.
Yeah. So let me just make a just ask an observational question of just, if I ride around a lot and look at things. And so probably, at one point there were a lot of dairy farms in the Shenandoah Valley, because you can ride down the road and see the old kind of decrepit barns, big, huge decrepit barns now. So that probably would have been 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yep.
Yeah. And then people started getting jobs in the city, farming part-time, mostly beef. When they're farming part-time, usually with cattle, it's beef.
Right.
Yeah.
When they're doing it part-time, because a dairy farmer,
you got to work every day.
You got to work every day, and you got to get up really early. And you can take a vacation, but the cows still need to be milked twice a day.
Just ask one of our potential sponsors, Gerald Garber.
That's right. Yeah, Gerald.
So what a good guy.
So, and the other thing was that there became a lot of things that started pushing dairy farmers out of business was because of the economics of these early small farms were not grade A dairies, but as health inspection became tougher and in the cities they were really wanting to have higher levels of sanitation, and all these little farms couldn't keep up with that. And it's, once you get into things like the milking machines and things like that, it requires a lot more money. So economically, it was really hard to keep up and modernize and keep your milking parlor up. I mean, Gerald Garber, for instance, has he has a whole computer room that controls his dairy farm. So you need to, it's all about technology, and his cows, his ladies wear little bracelets on their ankles that takes their temperature and sees how much milk they give and how much feed they get, and it's all controlled by the computers. So the little guys kind of get pushed out, and even our guys, who were the biggest guys around, are nothing. I mean, Gerald's one of the biggest dairy farmers around, and it's amazing farm there. But if you go out to California or some of these farms, they've got 10,000 cows.
Right.
So it's the same reason why wheat left this area, why apples left this area. Our small diversified farms didn't have the land and the level to do factory farming.
Right.
And that's what some of those, big dairy farms out west are factory farms.
Cool. So by the time you get, you still got dairy farms with their big, you'll still see the people that have some beef cattle, but not a lot. They're usually part-time farmers. And then you've got some full-time farmers in the valley. Yeah.
Right.
Let me ask you another question. This deals with trees, which kind of deals with cows. So when the valley was first settled, did they start cutting? Were there trees? Was everything trees?
No, no, it actually wasn't. The valley had it had a lot of these openings, these bogs, or these sods and these balds. But on the valley floor, the first descriptions are that there were these kind of great savannas of grasslands. And although the evidence, we don't have a lot of evidence, archaeological evidence yet, but apparently there were at one time buffalo, eastern buffalo, here, and elk certainly, and deer. And so you had grass, according to some descriptions, that was tall enough that you could wrap the tops of the grass around the saddle horns of your horse. Now,
okay.
I will give you a caveat on that. I've been studying some records from Augusta County in Virginia, because you had this free range. By the early 1600s, Virginia started making laws about stray livestock, because if my pig wanders over into your farm, you can't just take that pig and butcher it and eat it, because it's my pig.
Right.
And if my horse wanders over to your place, you can't just start riding that horse and saying it's yours. That's called horse thievery, and you can get hung for that. So Virginia started passing laws in the early 1600s about stray livestock, and also early on, before Virginia had good roads, about boats too. Like you couldn't just grab my rowboat and make use of it. that evolved into the 1770s, where you had to, if I found a horse that wasn't mine that wandered onto my property, I had to advertise. I had to go down to the courthouse and I had to describe that horse in great detail. I had to have a couple witnesses describe it. I had to advertise it in the newspaper and on the courthouse door. And if somebody, if you said, "Oh, that's my horse," and you gave the right description, then you had to pay me for boarding it, and you had to pay me for my cost in advertising it and recording it. If you never show up, it becomes my horse. But I've done my due diligence and have recorded it. So that was all recorded. Every county was required to keep what was called an estray book, ESTRAY, which is just a longer version of stray. And from 1775 or so in Virginia, or in Augusta County, until about 1905, Augusta County's estray books are intact, and they're just incredible resources. There's paragraphs that are this long about a single cow or a single horse, and I've been going through those for many years and creating sort of spreadsheets with those animals. So I know, for instance, that most of the cows in Augusta County were red in a certain period of time. I know that in Augusta County, they used horses as draft animals because of the descriptions that are written up about, looks like he's been worked in the harness, looks like he's been worked with a yoke. The cattle show up, mostly the stray cattle show up in the spring and the fall when those big herds are being driven through, and cattle branches off and decides to go grab this mouthful of grass and it gets lost. And I also know that the horses were a lot shorter. So
Of course.
So the horses were really short. They were pony size. And so when they say you could take the grass and wrap it around the saddle horn, it might not be as tall as we're thinking now. It might have been, it still was tall, but maybe pony size tall rather than big horse size tall.
I'm trying to envision Robert E. Lee, who's moving from Richmond. He's going somewhere today. We don't know where.
Yes.
But I'm trying to envision, like Traveler being like, about 2 feet, 3 feet.
Yeah. And Traveler was, a result of those free range animals. You really don't start seeing like these big draft animals, like percherons and animals like that until 20 or 30 years after the Civil War in Augusta County in our area. So it's really an interesting, these estray books are fascinating for a lot of reasons. And I'll send you a few paragraphs from those estray books so you can see just how detailed they are, because it will say one pied cow about 6 months old with a crooked left horn and 3 narrow swallow cuts out of the left ear and a penny-sized hole out of the right ear.
Yeah, there's some detail going on.
Yeah.
Well, Nancy, we probably ought to wrap up here before the internet blows up on us here.
Yes.
And this may end up being 2 shows because this is a lot of information. You got your cattle book. You got some North Carolina cattle books.
We got the cattle book.
We want to thank Catherine Morris for being one of our sponsors. She's the full sponsor. You can sponsor 1 show for $25, 6 shows for $100.
Right.
We're going to do a series of 12. So if you want to do 12, it's $150.
Right. Yeah. So that's the bargain one.
Yeah. And just get in touch with Nancy about that. She's handling that. I'm Richard Adams. This is Nancy Sorrells. I'm a kind of a historian. I'm curious about history. Nancy actually, when she starts talking about cow details, it's unbelievable. So thanks for listening and watching, and we'll be back with you.
And I should say, I hope you found this cattle story utterly moving.
Oh man, let's stop now.
And we should also thank Cheryl Lyon for her
our flying dog.
Her flying dog with the quill pen that does our logo. So thank you, Cheryl, for that.
Does she
creativity.
sell Silver Lake? Does she sell things?
Yes. So Silver Lake, you can stop by at Silver Lake Mill in Dayton and check out the store there.
Okay. All right. Thank you for listening and watching.
Okay. Have a good day.